I'd like to thank Mauricio and thank La Stampa. I'd also like to thank John Elkann. I think whatever you may think about this particular panel, it's very hard to think of somebody who would have gathered together quite so many journalists from quite so many places. I'm not sure what the collective noun for this many editors is. We discussed it. It could be a swarm of editors, a plague of editors. Somebody just suggested an endangered species of editors. But that is where we start from. And we have 4 very good ones here. From the right, we have Bobby Ghosh, the editor-in-chief of the Hindustan Times. Then we have Lionel Barber, the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times. We have Lydia Polgreen, the editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post. And we have Ascânio Seleme, the editor-in-chief of Globo. Between us, you probably have the editor with the most amount of readers in the world, which is Bobby, and you have the editor with the highest paywall in the world, which is me, with $25,000 for a Bloomberg terminal. Our main difficulty in this panel is to avoid invading the next group and avoid forcing our way into Zani's panel. So we are going to try as far as possible not to discuss the business model. And what we have gone along on our assumption is that we are assuming that the business model for journalism will continue to be one of some difficulty. We think that readers will generally pay more for good journalism, as Mauricio said, and we think that advertisers may pay more to put their adverts beside news that they trust and get rid of fake news, but our starting assumption is that the business model will be relatively tough, and we will try to avoid, where possible, discussing that. I suppose the underlying fact, which we all talked about earlier, is even if the business model was the same, all our businesses would be being changed by technology. They were being changed by the new ways we have of doing things. And so I've asked the panel to dive in, and we will start with questions. You can also, as Mauricio said, you can email me questions, which I will attempt to do from this. Let's begin. Lionel, tell us what the newsroom of the future is going to look like.
It's going to be slightly smaller, I suspect, but it's going to be made up of brilliant, creative people who have specialist knowledge, who don't necessarily come from traditional journalist roots. They may be specialists from outside, civil service, NGOs. I think second, they're going to be people who understand, one, that although they're journalists, and by the way, John, I'm not invading anybody's patch, but journalists do need to have a sense of what the business is about. They need to understand how we make money, what is sustainable, and so they will also have the ability, I think, to have software skills, and they're going to have, lastly, an ability to do deep and original reporting. That is what is necessary for newspapers and news organizations to survive. You have to have something which is distinctive, different from the rest of the pack. You could be in Boston, and you could be, if you're reporting in a local newspaper, you'd be writing about the medical sector. You wouldn't just be writing about corruption. I could go on, but the crucial point here is to be distinctive and have the ability to reconnect with the reader, because in the old days, you didn't know who the readers were. They just go to the shop and buy the newspaper. So reconnect, be specialist, and have lots of different skills.
Lydia, do you agree with that? You come from the dot-com world.
I think that that's a really important aspect of the future, particularly for organizations like the FT that have very successfully executed a pay model where you're speaking to an extremely sophisticated, highly educated, and frankly quite wealthy audience. That level of specialization and expertise is going to be absolutely essential. When I think about really kind of mass market and free to consumer publications like HuffPost, I think that the most important quality is actually is actually trust, but it's in a slightly different way than I think Lionel means. I think the brand trust gets you in the door when you're the FT. I think a lot about ways to engender a sense of fellow feeling and empathy with our readers, and to bring them into our fold and get them caring about things that they might not actually be that engaged with.
But does that involve a different kind of journalistic team? Does it involve writing different sorts of articles? We can come back to the issue of quality later, but in terms of the format, does it mean that the sort of articles...
It means that your stories are going to be much more visual, that your stories will lean much harder on things like emotion and humor. I see our role in the ecosystem as being a news organization for people who frankly are never going to pay for news and maybe don't even think the news is that important to them. But our job and our civic role in society is to make the news interesting and to make the news relevant and to engender a sense of trust with our readers.
Do you think that's true? And Bobby, do you think that's true in India? I mean, you are someone who has millions of people, even in the local market.
Yeah, we have a slightly different situation in India, but just to one other quality, I think the digital newsroom, the newsroom of the future is going to require coders, a lot more coders. Right now, out of 600 journalists at Hindustan Times, maybe 15 are coders. That's nowhere near enough. I agree with Lionel that the Hindustan Times of the future may have a smaller number of journalists, but a much larger proportion would be able to code and use data, use video, use their cell phones to shoot video themselves, use their cell phones to edit video on the fly. We're doing some of that already, really early stages. But a new suite of skills, some of which need to be taught in a structured, scientific way. I mean, many people who, like myself, got into journalism without going through journalism school because you could. I don't think in the future you can get into journalism if you don't have some of these skills, whether you get them at a journalism school or you buy them piecemeal in different courses.
Do you think at Globo you are going to require computer coders to be journalists?
I think the newsroom will be filled by journalists in the future as it is today. We agreed, everyone here, that the skills must change, that we have to put together much more technology available to do the good stuff, but still we are going to produce in the future what we're producing today, news. That's our business. We are going to produce news. We're not going to produce bread or anything else. We can produce news with other skills, with other tools like video that we do already, like
Your business is interesting because you took 3 newspapers, a quality one and 2 tabloids.
Yeah, we merged.
And you pushed them together.
Yeah, we just merged in the beginning of this year 3 newsrooms into one. The Globo newsroom, that's a quality paper, and the 2 popular papers of the organization, Extra and Espresso, into a single newsroom, preserving the value of each of the brands. You see, it's important to preserve the values, but the stuff is the same for the 3 newspapers. That's a very difficult step that we did, but it's working very, very hard. I would be pleasure to talk about that with you, but it would take 5 or 6 hours. I don't think we have that much time.
Can I take a theme with all of you? Bobby hinted at it, the idea that journalists could be replaced by technologists. At Bloomberg, for instance, we are automating news. Many of the people here who run companies, when a company announces its profits, when I arrived at Bloomberg 2 years ago, what happened is we had a team of speed journalists who specialized in rushing and being able to decipher those earnings. Now what happens is the previous night, they sit and they set up a template so that computers can dive on top of those and do the jobs of humans at that precise moment. We still need journalists to set up the templates before we start. But is that the sort of thing that is going to continue, or is that just a very narrow financial thing? Lionel, do you want to kick off on that?
John, I just want to reassure the audience, the robots are not going to take over.
But your journalists may have to work more with robots, as ours do.
We're happy to work with anybody. I mean, the more, of course, what we call technically the ho-hum story, the story that's just middling, you know, a market news report, stock market news report that just says what went up, what went down. I mean, a robot could do that, but we constantly putting the effort, the emphasis on high value-added journalism. What are you getting extra to justify, frankly, charging? And just to this point about robots, you know that for me the most important thing is about the voices of the FT. And that means commentators. No, you can have great reporters as well, but commentators. And these, I was explaining my job to an Australian the other day and explaining about dealing with commentators. And he said, I think I now know what you do. You're essentially a football manager. And what he meant by that is, look, these people are stars. They're really, really valuable. They're what make the paper and the website really special. And John, no, a robot is not going to replace Martin Wolf.
Can I add something? I think this kind of news, the journalism that robots can do, is not what's going to get their place in the future. That's commodity that don't sell. Not a single person will come to my newspaper to buy a subscription to read what's a commodity like this of the Wall Street or the soccer game or etc. that like a robot can do, right?
I would venture back that people pay $25,000 in order to get that news 3 seconds faster than someone else. But Bobby, what did you mean by this idea that technology is going to replace people?
No, I think I may not have articulated that well enough. I don't think technology is going to replace journalists. I think journalists have to learn to use the technology better. Learn to use it to make their stories stronger, make their stories more appealing, learn to use data visualization techniques to tell stories that you don't need 1,500 words. A really beautiful piece of data visualization can tell the story more effectively and digitally than 1,500 words in the paper or even online. That's what I mean. I don't think we're talking about, certainly not in general news. Lionel's point about the sort of humdrum stock, this stock went up, that stock came down, that's in sort of financial and stock market coverage, I can imagine that. But in general newspapering, I can't see it. I can't see robots or bots replacing the human hand. But I can see the human hand learning to use these technologies to make the human element more valuable than it is now.
Lydia, how do you see this debate? You're in the center of technology.
Well, it's funny. I mean, you know, talking about you know, journalism and coders. I mean, you know, Yahoo and AOL just came together to form Oath. You know, when two companies love each other very much, they come up with a new name. You know, we have engineers, coders, like all, but I actually think that that's not where the crisis in journalism lies. And technology can be neither a particularly good nor a particularly bad actor. To me, the real crisis and the real transformation that needs to happen is really about trust, as I said earlier. The most recent Pew survey found that 18% of Americans have a high level of trust in the national media. Local media, the percentage is about 21%. It's not surprising because in the United States, since 1990, 250,000 local journalism jobs have vanished. I mean, just gone up in thin air. So I see a lot of parallels between our industry and the consolidation that's happened in industries like banking, but also consolidation of power in elite centers like, you know, the big cities in the world. So I actually think that the most important transformation that needs to happen with journalism, and technology actually can help with this, is embedding a deeper sense of trust and a deeper sense of connection with the way that the vast majority of people actually live their lives.
But does that deeper connection, does that require a change of format? Does that require, Bobby seemed to be saying we should produce shorter, or the trend is towards shorter, more dynamic, more graphically
Possibly. I mean, I think our experience has been really mixed on this. Both when I worked at the New York Times and at HuffPost, we found that our audience actually engages most deeply with our most deeply reported and most comprehensive and frankly traditional kinds of journalism. You know, we did an 8,000-word piece about the gun control debate that took it from the perspective of bullets rather than the weapons themselves, and it was told entirely through the eyes of a trauma surgeon working at Temple Philadelphia Hospital. hospital. That was our most engaged piece of journalism that we've published in the last, month or so. And, Senator Chris Murphy read from it on the floor of the Senate of the United States. That is a very old format, and it works brilliantly. This experience was the same with the New York Times. So I think that my personal view is that we should worry less about formats and worry much more deeply about the relationship that we have with our audience.
Lionel, do you agree?
Well, I just want to pick up what Bobby was saying about software and coding. I think 10 years ago, if you redesign the website, I'm talking from deep, painful personal experience here, you'd have a group of journalists and they would invite some software people around the table and they would instruct the software engineers and say, I want it looking like this and I want it to do that. And the software engineers would go back. 6 months later, the journalists would still be picking at it. That relationship is completely inverted, and correctly so. Software is increasingly driving and shaping the journalism. And rightly, because now we're working in multimedia formats. We're moving away, by the way, a bit from newspapers here. But I think it's incredibly important to understand that in the new newspaper digital age, you've got to, one, the journalists have to have coding skills, and two, the relationship between the software people and the editorial, that needs to be more level.
Well, the product at Hindustan Times, and I know this is true in other organizations as well, the product people sit in the newsroom. They don't sit with the IT folks. They're not sitting with the infrastructure, the guys who are in charge of the cables and the computers. The product people sit with us. And they come to our first meeting in the morning, where we look at the data from yesterday's traffic. They are part of the conversation about what we can do to goose the system and why the site is moving slowly, why the site is running too many ad scripts. These are conversations that didn't used to happen before. When I started out in journalism, the circulation guy, who would be the equivalent, or the printing plant guy, would not come to the editorial discussions. Now the product guy is very much part of it. And so, yeah, the product guy is telling us things, we're talking to them in a sort of constant conversation. It's not once in 6 months we sit down and say, it's time to refresh the app or time to refresh the site, let's go do it.
And is the paper of the future, do we still see a future for print papers? Lionel?
Very much so, on condition that, one, they become much, much more efficiently produced. So the way we've done it is to say, produce the digital content with all the expertise around who the audience is, what we're publishing. But then the newspaper is derived from that content, from the digitally first produced content. The second point is it needs to be really easy to read. And that means great design matters much, much more than it used to. And third, I think we have to recognize that the great opportunity is at the weekend, because people have more time to read. It is a different reading experience, obviously, from reading mobile and reading like that, and reading lean back on a newspaper. But I think in that respect, I think there's a great future for a weekend read in newspaper terms. Just lastly, I just say, when we talk about newspapers, we have to realize, somebody said that things would be smaller. They're going to look different. They're going to be digitally produced. They may be automatically produced in the home, not so much newsprint on a stand.
I'll come quickly to you and just give an idea, and then I'll come back to Ascânio and Rob, particularly to find out whether print is still a possibility more in the emerging world. Sorry.
I think print absolutely has a huge future, and I think my former employer, the New York Times, is really, I think, a great pioneer in offering special goodies to their print subscribers, and they had a huge leg up on digital-only news organizations in their distribution network. I think that the distribution of VR headsets, for example, was just a huge win and something that felt very new and exciting. The other thing I would say is that the process of being disrupted and surviving that disruption is actually incredibly good for an organization. And I come at this from a slightly different perspective, both from having been at the New York Times and seen the digital revolution happen there, but also now I run a legacy digital news organization, right? HuffPost was born in the era of where SEO was king, and the apex piece of journalism was what time is the Super Bowl. And then we ourselves got disrupted by the rise of social and the rise of distribution. But what I've since realized is that actually we can catch up. We can use our mastery of SEO, our technological skills, the great journalism that we do to catch up on the age of distribution. And yet, at a time when people are saying homepages are dead, nobody's going to destination, everything is going to push to you, we're actually finding that homepage traffic for us is increasing, that daily active users of our app is increasing. So we have the best of both worlds. We are both now masters of distribution, #1 publisher on Facebook, #1 most engaged publisher on Facebook, but we also have destination power and can draw people to us. So I think that the transformational lessons that print papers learn in becoming digital will help future-proof them in the inevitable next transformation to come.
We'll come back to social media in just a second, but give us the perspective.
Yeah, I agree totally with him. The newspaper has its place in the future. It must be more comfortable to read, of course, but people love the organization that journalists do on the information. The editorial thing, it's important to readers.
But do they need that in paper?
The hierarchy that you give in the paper, it's important. It's much more efficient than the putting together news in the site, in the digital platform. That's why the flip of my newspaper, I guess it's the same for everyone. The flip, it's a success in Brazil. People love to read the newspaper, the paper, on the iPad, on his smartphone, you see. So I agree totally. The newspaper must be, will still be a little less reduced in the future, basically for a niche, but it's still strong because we do what people like to have. We have this is the work for editors to establish priorities, and we do this better in the paper format.
Well, we not only believe there's a future for newspapers, we are putting our money where our mouth is. This weekend, Hindustan Times is launching a new edition in Pune, a city outside Bombay, with an opening print run of 100,000 copies. In the year 2017, we're launching a new print edition. We do believe that there is a future for newspapers. But Lionel's point is well taken, which is that the newspaper cannot look, feel, read like it has for the last 75 years. I mean, with allowing for some innovations in design and color and photography, newspapers read like they did when I was a kid. That can't be right. People don't read like that anymore. It used to be where my dad would wake up, go to the front door, open the door, take the newspaper with his cup of tea, and then engage with the world. Today I wake up, I first switch on my phone, I check my Twitter account, I check my Facebook account, I check my email and a bunch of things. It may be half an hour before I've gotten out of bed, never mind going to the front door to pick up the newspaper. That means that nothing in that paper is likely to be fresh. If I didn't already catch up with it yesterday, I've certainly caught up with it this morning. That is the challenge. How do we present something? What is the excuse for you to go and physically pick up that newspaper?
And does that require a different format?
Yeah, let me try and pick up that thought, because I think it's incredibly important. Why should I pick up the newspaper in the morning? What is different? How does it relate? How does it complement the digital offering that I can get now? I can get the news now on a smartphone. I can get, look at websites. I can look at social media. So what have you got? I think one way, I didn't come up with this phrase, It originated, I think, in Sweden, at Dagens Nyheter newspaper. They broke this down 3 or 4 years ago, and we obviously copied them with their permission, to think about slow news and fast news. And essentially they said, for digital, that's fast news. Now obviously if you have a huge breaking news story overnight, the newspaper has to capture some of that. But it's also going to capture slow news. What I mean by that is stuff going on underneath the surface that isn't absolutely necessary to publish, happened yesterday, going to publish tomorrow. You might have something that you've been working on, an investigation, or something 3 days ago happened, and you're going to prepare news pages in advance. Now that way, you can make actually the production of the paper much more efficient. It isn't, in other words, a factory. This is a more selective process. And breaking down between fast and slow news is I think, one way of looking at the problem.
Lydia, do you agree with that?
I do. I also think that what this really comes down to is understanding your customer, and being there for your customer at the moment when they need you, and in the right format and in the right way. And we just have so many more tools and ways. And I mean, I envy my colleagues with print publications because of the extraordinary creativity that goes into making a delightful physical object. I miss that sometimes. And at the Times, there was this moment where the they sort of said, well, we're going to have all of the best digital people only working on digital. And some of the people who came up through digital said, well, hang on, that's not fair. Like, we want to spend some time designing great magazine features and designing, wonderful visual features for our print section. So I really think that it's about finding the best place and the best experience for the consumer. And it really just needs to be absolutely driven by that.
Just do one last thing on this, then we move on to the issue of trust, which you brought up, which you've already got several questions about. This issue about social media, you look at the shooting last week in Virginia, that was actually driven initially by social media. At Bloomberg, we have 45 people whose only job is to monitor social media with the help of a lot of computers.
Yeah.
To what extent is that beginning to represent a challenge to the sort of newspaper which you all talked about? Bobby, do you want to go?
We like to think, to anticipate some of the questions on trust, we like to think that our social media voice, because it carries the implied trust of a 95-year-old newspaper with impeccable standing, gives us both a sense of responsibility, but it also gives us a little leg up over some random Joe who's somewhere and taken a picture and put it out. We take our social media personality very seriously. It is something that you don't have as a newspaper, the ability to reinforce the voice of the newspaper on a real-time basis constantly. The real challenge for us is to avoid slipping into snark. So much of social media now is snark. And I like it. I like consuming it. It's a lot of fun when it's done well. But I have to be conscious that our Hindustan Times' voice cannot be that one. We can, levity has its place. Brevity is implied because we are talking about 140 characters. But a sense of responsibility that comes with being the Hindustan Times is something I'm constantly aware of.
A quick question from our audience, from Paul Madsen, who's the editor-in-chief of Paper in Copenhagen, is what's your opinion on Facebook? Are they friend or enemy?
Right now, they are the necessary evil.
I think we can understand that.
I was just going to follow up on Bobby's high-minded approach to social media and just say, as a self-confessed Twitter user, it is one of the most dangerous tools around. I always like to look at people's profiles, including especially Financial Times journalists, who say, Joe blogs, construction correspondent, Financial Times, views not my own. And you look at the latest tweet and it says, Trump, sad. And you think, this is a real problem, that actually this medium encourages people to be snarky, because then you get more followers, usually, and also you don't have any control over it. And they would, of course, say, well, yes, I know. Here's a classic example, actually. It was an FT journalist. I'm not going to name him because this is a family occasion. But this journalist actually broke a big scoop on Fox News. Or actually, it wasn't Fox News, but it was another story on his own Twitter account before breaking it on the FT. And the reason is because they think the Twitter account is their own. So I can't, we're looking at how to manage this a bit, but I would say social media is definitely a second, it can be a very good marketing tool, but it is definitely a double-edged sword.
I mean, I don't know, I have a very sort of, my view on this is very much shaped by how I grew up. I mean, I spent most of my childhood in Kenya and Ghana in extremely information-constrained environments, watching historical events unfold. There was a coup when I was 6-year-old in Kenya. There was a transition to democracy when I was in high school in Ghana. There was no way for me to read New York Times journalism. There was no way for me to read, well, really consume any journalism other than state TV in Ghana. And I find it very hard to be cynical about tools that allow people to have access to and be part of the conversation. I became a foreign correspondent really at the dawn of the era of social media. I started my first Twitter account in 2009 when I was leaving the West Africa Bureau of the New York Times and going to India, and it was very fortuitous timing because India had just blossomed into one of the most fascinating places where the Twitter conversation was happening. And I remember at the time, I set my account to private, and I thought, I hope nobody at the New York Times finds out that I'm doing this. Lord knows what they'll think. They'll think I'm trying to promote myself, or that I'm, off doing something that's going to denigrate the good name of the New York Times, and I was very shy. Less than a year later, I was being begged to come back to New York and convince other reluctant journalists to sort of hop into the fray and become part of the conversation. So I guess I take a different view, and that is that you take the rough with the smooth, but the ability of audiences to, sometimes in not very polite terms, and I would include the Hindutva horde in India, who've come for me a number of times. You take the rough with the smooth, but I think that the ability of audiences to use their voices, to respond to us, we're publishers, we're extremely powerful, can only be a net positive for our industry.
I think what you're seeing, the audience, is we are a group of people whose lives have been changed by this. I became editor of The Economist 6 days after Twitter came into being. We're now trying to set up a global television network with them. Just to jump towards the main subject of questions, which we kept back so far, fake news.
Just let me add something about this.
Do, very quickly.
You didn't ask me, sorry if I'm... But I think we have this social media as a fishing pond. We are not naive. They represent a very strong threat for us all. That's why we are here today. But we have to be where our readers are. We have to go there to bring their eyeballs to our content. So we do it with kind of soft perspective, but we should be, and we are, in the social media, founding our readers, bringing them to our pages.
Okay, so we all agree we all need to be involved in this field, but the subject which several people in the audience have picked up on, the subject of fake news, that the only way in which the organizations on this podium are going to survive is if people trust us, and in this era. And maybe we can break fake news down into 2 or 3 different sorts. You have fake news as in a government deliberately setting out to misinform people, as would appear to have happened with Russia. You have a second sort, which I might describe as moronic news, which is where someone tweets that the Queen is dead or whatever, and is then picked up by a variety of bots. Sometimes that can be a government picking up on those things. But the last one is partisan news, where people are not necessarily writing something's wrong, it's just something that a lot of people disagree with. And I wondered, just generally saying, people in the audience have picked up on one of the things Lydia said. What is the protection against those different versions of fake news, and which ones should we worry about?
Well, I mean, I think that the real cure for any kind of fake news is more real news, and really flooding the zone with great high quality journalism. I think all three of them like pose different kinds of dangers. Some of them are more susceptible to technological fixes than others, right? Like just the sort of dumb fake news, something that can kind of be filtered or blocked or cut out in some way. Reducing the financial incentives for teenagers in Macedonia to pump out falsehoods, that seems like a fairly easy fix. You know, partisan news, I think, has an important role to play. And
you implicitly sort of seem to support that when you were talking about giving people, I suppose Lionel and I are both rather nervous about letting journalists tweet their own personal opinions.
Yeah.
You are keen to push that.
I am, and I think that, you know, readers are wise and they have a point of view, and I think that one important way to increase engagement and to increase loyalty is to sort of, you know, open the curtain a little bit and acknowledge the fact that your journalists are human. You know, I spent most of my career as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, and it took a while for me to get comfortable with this idea that people were going to glean from the things that I wrote about or the things things about my biography, about my identity, and assume things about my journalism based on it. And eventually I realized that you just kind of have to be open about these things, and that there are many different kinds of journalism, and that all of these different kinds of journalism have a role to play in creating a vibrant ecosystem that will leave everyone better informed. You know, I mean, I read Breitbart. It seems that very few people are reading Breitbart. Their traffic is down by about 50%. So the marketplace is also regulating, you know, what points of view are exciting and acceptable and which ones aren't.
Robbie, can I put a question to you from Sergio Allegri in the audience? Fake news and post-truth have a big impact on how digital news is read and perceived by people. What kind of control does an editor-in-chief have, and what are his or her responsibilities?
This may be a slightly radical view. I think fake news is the best thing that could happen to mainstream media, because it's already out there. There is a backlash beginning against fake news. Because there have been so many flagrant instances of fake news, people are pausing to go back to a more reliable source. Not enough people, not yet, but I think that's happening. I can say from Hindustan Times' own experience, there have been a couple of instances recently where on a given day there was a fake news thing that went completely wild on social media, and we noticed that our website got a spike in readers looking for a story on that topic.
Who do you think will stop fake news? Do you think it'll be readers, or do you think it'll be advertisers?
Yeah, I don't think we have control over fake news. We only have control over the news we put out. Advertisers as well as readers are much more. Advertisers have far more to lose, and readers are beginning to get smarter about picking and choosing. Now, there'll always be people who like to be in their echo chamber, who want to read fake news that confirms their point of view. I'm not sure we have a great deal of control over that.
Get to Ascânio and then Lionel.
Let me see. Fake news are not news. Partisan news are not news. Alternative facts are not news. Let me be a little philosophic here. Imagine a world without a free press, without newspapers, a world of Venezuela's, Russia's, North Korea's, Saudi Arabia's. It would be a very dangerous place to live. Imagine the United States under Trump without the New York Times, without the Washington Post, without the Financial Times. So what I'm telling here, we are here struggling not to save ourselves. We are here fighting to save the world. That's the fact. We are not talking about, we shouldn't call fake news news at all. We shouldn't call partisan news news because they have a side. If you have one side, you don't have.
But there's a difference, isn't there, between the deliberate fake news and then a lot of things at the moment which are being described as fake news are really partisan.
Yeah.
You know, there is an old joke about Rupert Murdoch being one of the great geniuses of modern media.
Yes, for sure.
Because he spotted a tiny niche in America which was 40% of the population, and that's what he gave Fox News. Yeah. The old news services were not supplying conservative America.
Right.
You have to have there has to be some equality of opinion.
Yeah.
I would just...
Sorry, Lionel. Okay.
Yeah.
When it comes to fake news, we at the Financial Times take full responsibility for what appears on our platform. That's rather different from some important aggregators. and we take full legal liability. And that can be a little scary sometimes, because people have deep pockets and large egos.
But would you,
I think your 3 point, if we just take the 3 categories, first of all, in terms of fake news propagated by the state or state-sponsored entities, to me that's propaganda, and that's what you just have to parse and interpret and be careful. Moronic news, when I took over as editor at the FT, I said, I don't care what the story is, we must have 2 independent sources for a story. Every time you go for one source, you're dead. And that includes, by the way, even when you take a call from the president. The third category is much the most complicated, because fake news, in essence, it's not even partisanship. You are now dealing in certain important Western democracies, notably the United States. You're dealing with a world of alternative facts, where you can present something as simple as how many people turned up at the president's inauguration, and you can have 2 completely different opinions, even when it's independently verified by the National Park Service, etc. Now that's a light version. You could have another version, which is much, much more serious. But essentially, because of a variety of factors I don't have time to go into, that where you have an increased partisanship, you have a world of alternative facts. In that world, I agree with Bobby, and I agree with the others, that there are opportunities for trusted brands, trusted news brands. That's certainly where we're coming from.
Very quickly, at the very beginning, you laid out that difference between you and me, for that matter, and Google and Facebook. Would you rather, from an editor's point of view, would you rather that they were purely platforms, they showed no editorial discretion at all, or do you think they should be treated in the same way as us?
I think that they should, of course I'm speaking as the editor, I'm not speaking from the business standpoint as such. I think that they need to take responsibility fully for what appears on their platforms. And when they say, well, actually, we're hiring 120 new fact checkers, one of my colleagues here, or actually I should say, Robert, I think it was Robert Thompson, I'm not misquoting him here, I think he said the right thing, which is, oh, you're hiring 120 new fact checkers? We used to call them journalists. Thank you, Robert.
Robbie, you were.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. They have to take more responsibility, and advertisers are already beginning to push back. We're already hearing in the ecosystem, advertisers are not happy to have their ads against content over which they have no control. They don't know what is going to be shown immediately after an ad. It could be a beheading video, or something equally reprehensible, or something that runs completely against the values of the product or service that is being advertised. I think that the money will determine that. I think advertisers are already beginning to ask, and they will impose more discipline on these platforms. We depend very heavily on Google to send us traffic. In India, Google is the biggest, the Google News page is the biggest source of traffic for all Indian news organizations. It's not Facebook, although Facebook is pretty big. Google is huge.
Can I push you on another area, or come back to all 4 of you on this? When people talk about threats to the quality of journalism, they talk about fake news and the different version. They then talk about different ways in which advertisers are kind of pushing news, pushing in advertisements which are disguised as news to some extent. But the other big one which people bring up repeatedly is the failures or the scarcity of investigative journalism. Yes, you get investigative journalism into Donald Trump, but you look at, say, all the American delegations, the congressional delegations. There was a study the other day that showed all the big city papers, which used to be so powerful, only a handful of them had people inside Washington following the congressional delegation from their state. Maybe 1 or 2 for California, very few. So politicians are not being held to account. Is that something that you see, that investigative journalism, especially at the local level, is not being supported?
Well, we do in Brazil lots of investigative. Every journal, every piece of information, every article demands an investigation, of course. So every article is an investigative effort. But yes, we do have a very large team of people dedicated absolutely to go further, no matter how much it takes, no matter, or it matters, but not that much, how much it costs to produce very, very good stories. We think that this is what makes the difference between us and the journalists, because today everyone is a journalist. If you have a telephone on the hand, you can make a text, you can take a photo, you can make a movie, and you think you're a journalist. No, it's not. We do rest confident that the good journalism needs investment. You have to have the most talented people affordable in your newsroom to produce the quality that will bring subscribers to you. We should not talk about the business models that you orientated
You're allowed
us.
to briefly.
But I think, on my point of view, on the point of view of the editor, we have to be the most competitive, the most talented newspaper in my country to become successful, to bring to me the money, to bring to my newspaper the money that the subscribers will bring. They are the ones that will support us here today and in the future. So we do investigate.
Not all advertisers are historically that enthusiastic about investigative journalism. Lydia, maybe you were nodding whilst I was speaking. Do you see a collapse in America at the city level in terms of...
I think there's been an utter, complete, and total collapse. Like I said earlier, 250,000 journalism jobs have disappeared since 1990. That is, the vast majority of them in local journalism. I actually think that there's a tremendous civic opportunity here for, civic-minded people, some of whom may be in this room, who are interested in investing. I think that there are some really interesting nonprofit, for-profit, collaborative models around investigative reporting. Some of them built around universities.
Is that your way of describing the Washington Post, or is that?
Well, and there's also organizations that have extremely powerful publishing tools that they could make available to publishers, because if you run a small local newspaper, your technology department might just be one guy, but the cost of that one guy to manage your CMS, do the front end and the back end and all that kind of stuff, may be the difference between you being able to have a going concern or not. So I think there's tremendous room for innovation in this space. CJR just did the Columbia Journalism Review just did a whole issue looking at the problem of local journalism in the United States. And I'm seeing a lot of excitement and a lot of activity, both from not as much from a business perspective, but certainly from philanthropic organizations and also from civic leaders and wanting to get involved.
But not enough. Lionel, do you agree with that? That there are some ways in which local investigative journalism has been pushed by these things, but by any measure, it has gone down. And our role as the fourth estate that holds power accountable is, at least at that level, slipping.
I think that's absolutely right, but I think that we're also seeing some bright spots. I mean, the New York Daily News, which is a shadow of its former self, it's just been absolutely hollowed out. Last year, they took home the top Pulitzer, which is the one for public service, based on the work of a single reporter. And so I think we need to celebrate and really get behind that sort of success.
No.
I think we just need to be just a little bit careful when we talk about investigative journalism, because ever since Watergate, it's been invested with this mystique that essentially you're only a serious investigative journalist if you knock off a CEO or knock off a president or something like that. I like to say to our journalists, you're all investigative journalists. You've all got to be curious. You've all got to be going for deep and original journalism and not just take press releases. We don't. But you've got to go 5 steps. You talk about multiple sources, not 2. So with that caveat, I agree. Obviously, local newspapers have been immensely hollowed out in the United States, also in Britain. My recommendation here is, first of all, you need to be able to give people some time to take on a story. And in this world that we live in now with social media, where people are expected to tweet, do a podcast, go on video, write 3 stories or 2 stories for the newspaper, and then maybe they have to re-edit it for the web. Where's the space in this crushed news cycle for serious investigative journalism? And we need to create that. The second point I'd make is that we need to have a proper threshold. So for me, investigative journalism means not just putting someone out of a job or exposing wrongdoing. It's what is the redress? What is the outcome here? And I think there's been some magnificent reporting. The New York Times has done some, the Post obviously, but also reporting on the ground in places like Africa, where a brave woman journalist, we just honored the Mike Elliott Award in New York, for someone who's talking about assaults on women, who's talking about disease, reporting it, and you get action in public policy as a result of a lone but strong voice. That really counts. That for me is investigative journalism.
Well, do you want to talk about India a bit? Because India is a sort of special case in some ways.
For us, local news is where we think the future lies. I was joking about this earlier today, but it's easy for me to say this because my idea of local is a million people. But it is true, Delhi has 25 million people. There are neighborhoods that have 1 or 2 million people. I produce 6 different editions of the same paper in Delhi, and they're quite substantially different from each other because people who live in one neighborhood have very different local interests than people who live in another. And investigative journalism is where we will sink or swim. I think people want to know that the newspaper cares about things they care about and are willing to dive deep into the issues that bother them. And the beauty with the digital reality that we live in now, doing investigative journalism is a lot easier now than it used to be. There's so much more information available online immediately. You can use you can mobilize social media to get information. And on the flip side, because we are redefining ourselves as newspapers, there's also pressure to do more investigative journalism as the differentiator. If we can become the place for investigative journalism, then I feel like I deserve the loyalty of my reader. That will become a distinguishing factor. Advertisers don't like it? Tough. Advertisers are deserting us anyway.
On the subject of advertisers, just to come back on that last sort of threat to journalism people talk about a lot now, the idea that sponsored content is beginning to appear much more than it did before. When Lionel and I certainly began journalism, you had a page of advertising and then a page of editorial. Now on plenty of websites you can see some degree of merger between that. Is that something that you all worry about?
May I start? Yes. We have a very serious distinguish in our site for what is paid content and what's editorial content. Even the branded content that have the views of a new investigations of a report produced eventually by journalists are labeled on our website as paid content. So we are very comfortable with that.
It's funny. I mean, I think it's such a gray area and such a fine line. I often think about when I was a young reporter at the Times. I wrote my first news analysis. They call it a Q-head at the Times, and the editor, and this was probably in 2003. The editor who was editing it explained to me that a news analysis gets a ragged right margin rather than a justified margin, so that the reader will know that it's a news analysis. And I was like, yes, right, okay, absolutely. That's how they'll know. They have no idea, right? I mean, these visual cues, these labels, these things we do that are supposed to signal to readers, who are of course all extremely savvy and paying very close attention to our fonts and font sizes and little things written here or there, and you know how we lay out the page. It's garbage. I mean, of course, it's very difficult for readers to tell. So I think it's an area where any responsible publisher is taking very, very serious care, and I think that would include everybody up on the stage.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes that's come across, maybe a bit in the background, we'll hear much more about it in the next session, is the way the advertising model has shifted, and advertising, frankly, is going wholesale to the big digital platforms. And print advertising is shrinking rapidly. It depends on different organizations and pace. So how would you therefore criticize a news organization that's saying, well, we're going to get this money, and it's advertising, isn't it? I would answer, this is a slippery slope, because let's face up against it. The advertiser is basically telling you what you're going to put on your website. And you can say, well, it's just advertising. No, it isn't. Because they're going in for storytelling, they're getting them often to use your skills or outside skills to present it something like journalism. There is half an answer or three-quarters of an answer, and that is to make it absolutely clear, way beyond ragged right, that this is sponsored content. This is brand content. It is not the news. Of course, then you come across whether the company wants to put up with that. And that's when you have to say, politely, no.
I worry about it all the time. This is one of my biggest worries. In India, a tradition has set in where a lot of Bollywood content is branded content. And it's not just what you can say about somebody or some movie, but what you can't say about some other movie because they didn't buy the ad. We go through some really some really absurd contortions where we're interviewing a movie star because he has a movie coming out and therefore he is accessible, but the company that's produced the movie has not bought an ad in our paper, and therefore we cannot name the movie. So we're doing an interview with the movie star, and at best we'll say, so-and-so, who has a movie coming out next weekend? No name. Now, what I'm counting on, and it's a very thin hope, is that our readers are smarter than that. That our readers, it's not a question of labeling, labeling is important, or ragged right. The reader is smart enough to tell that that's rubbish, that's a plug. We find there's an interesting variation. We do this branded content stuff in the paper. We don't do it online. It might explain why our online movie traffic is off the charts. The stuff that is written only for online. But the stuff that is taken from the newspaper and reproduced online, nobody reads.
If I might, could I just quickly add one thing, which is, I think I used to believe very strongly that consumer revenue, subscription revenue, was ultimately better for independent journalism than advertising revenue. And I think there's a lot to that idea. But the original notion of newspapers, at least in the United States, is that you had to appeal to the broadest possible swath of society in order to attract a wide number of advertisers. And as society has gotten more and more stratified, I think there's some interesting risks that we should be thinking about among publications that are increasingly dependent upon consumer revenue for their future. Because I think your product ultimately starts to look more and more and fit more and more closely with its end user. So I think that journalism is always public service minded, but I think it's just something to be mindful of.
That ties into something which several people have sent messages about. Is the world we're describing in terms of editorial content, does that mean it's inevitably going to become more partisan? That if the people who are looking for revenues from a particular group of people paying for them, that they're going to look for like-minded souls?
Yeah. And I think that for me, I feel like we've arrived at this point where I don't even know what partisanship means anymore, or where the dividing lines are. I mean, the election in France, the traditional left and the traditional right were both completely out of the conversation, right? And I think that there are two big forces that have essentially scrambled left and right. Technological change and its increasing velocity, and the fallout, and the very uneven fallout of globalization, particularly backlash in the West. And we've seen that again and again and again. And I very consciously positioned HuffPost as being neither left nor right, but really oriented towards power and disempowered. And that doesn't line up very easily with any particular political party, really, in any of the markets where we're working. So
just let me push that, because I'm sure we all suffer from that particular problem.
Yes.
Do you do that by trying to choose columnists from both sides? What is your definition?
It's not really
of
about
balance?
centrism, because I think that the vast majority of newspaper columnists come from, if not the 1%, then that top 20%. And I'm just much more interested in voices. I mean, I want to hear those voices, and I'm grateful that the FT and the New York Times and the Washington Post and others publish them. But I think there are a lot more people we need to hear from and listen to, and that's the role that I feel that HuffPost needs to play in that marketplace.
Too elitist, Lionel. Again.
And that's not a criticism. I mean, I think that these are great publications, and they're really important voices to have in the conversation, but it can't be the only thing.
John, I know when you and I started in journalism in the 1950s, look.
When you were coming back in your midlife.
You asked about partisanship. If successive British governments keep calling referenda to solve difficult problems, we're definitely going to be more partisan. I've had more abused, more difficult, angry readers, and I blame a lot of it on referendum. Having said that, if you talk about new voices, look at Macron. Macron was a new voice. The expectations too high, etc. But that shows the value. I agree. You need to have your Olympian voices. I'm not going to use the word elitist, but for us at least, Olympian voices who are respected, who can interpret the world. But you also need new voices, and that will engage readers. And you definitely don't, especially for us, but I suspect for other newspapers, you definitely don't want to speak to the 49% or just the 51%. You've got to reach beyond that. And there are definitely ways for journalists to do that.
But you can see, we have the publisher of the New York Times here. At least some of the people who've seen the massive increase in New York Times circulation have put that down to, in part, other than Mark Thompson's brilliant leadership, they put it down also to, he said, let's not rule that out. They've also put it down to an energetic anti-Trump style, what would have seemed to that of the New York Times.
Well, I think that America is definitely, there are special circumstances applying, shall we say. That's very English understatement.
But you would have got people coming to read the FT because of being on the Remain side.
It is interesting the way that the liberal TV networks on the cable have gone up as Fox has gone down. So I think there's something to that. But again, for me, I think a newspaper is quite different from a TV medium.
Sorry, Ascânio,
I don't think the New York Times is a partisan newspaper, of course. And as I said in the beginning, I think any kind of news that is not listening to the whole bunch of the story, the whole side, every single side, it's not doing news. I have an example in Brazil in our newspaper just a few years ago when the President Dilma, the leftist government of the Workers' Party, was impeached. We, the press, were accused of a coup against the government because we have fulfilled the information on every single step of the investigation. All right, and today the president, the central-right president, Mr. Temer, that's involved up to here with bribery, and we did the Globo newspaper, my newspaper, did the story that brings him to the headlines as same as Dilma before. We are, on the other hand, attacked by the angry rightist readers. We are in the middle of everything, the newspapers, and that's where we should be. Not in one side or neither the other side.
But do you feel, because of special things to do with social media, perhaps isolating some supporters of Lula?
But that's for the social media, not for the newspapers. That's what I think.
Okay, we have one last question, which I told you all was coming, which was we were, unusually for journalists, we were given the chance to do something, and that we had to each come up with one thing that we thought would make a big difference to the future of the newspaper. So Robbie, maybe we can begin with you.
I'm going to repeat myself a little bit now, but in the circumstances of India, in the circumstances of the big cities in India where we operate, I think the future is in hyper-local news. More and more hyper-local news. We focus on the 3 C's of crime, classrooms, and commuting. Commuting is a very serious issue in India, not necessarily true in many other parts of the world. But I think if we drill down and focus on those things, we will remain relevant and we will remain, with the bells and whistles of investigative journalism, better display, better use of digital tools and all those things. But the fundamental thing is hyper-local and issues that people care about the most. That's where we have to live.
Lionel, what is the secret of the newspaper of the future?
Apart from having a great editor, I agree. I think that the crucial thing I would say, the recommendation is every journalist working for a newspaper needs to look at himself or herself in the mirror and say, what am I doing that makes my newspaper distinctive? Utterly distinctive. It can be anything. It could be the hyperlocal, it could be the great coverage of course, could be science, whatever. And then second, invest and expand in the weekend newspaper.
Lydia.
I would say brand. I think that when it comes to content, and particularly when it comes to news, because news is such an intimate product and is so bound up with our sense. I mean, if you go deep into research with, why people read news and things like that, it's so bound up in what you think of yourself, how you want to project yourself, what sort of person you want other people to think you are. So I think that in the case of news, brand isn't everything; it's the only thing, and that's something that I learned, working at the New York Times. They've done tremendous work on refining and honing their brand, and I think it's become a very powerful calling card for the company. But I think any news organization that isn't thinking about its brand with as much sophistication as a Unilever or Nike or Apple is missing out on the future.
Ascânio.
Well, in the future, I want to be surrounded with the most talented people, producing the most qualified content possible, to maintain with me my audience and to increase the new audience willing to pay for the quality products that I will put out.
Okay, I have been remarkably restrained in not giving my opinion on most of the things here, but for what it's worth, in the different debates, I would certainly be on the side of all the editors when it came to the impact of content that is from the advertisers. And I agree with them heartily about fake news. I think the answer to fake news probably lies with many of the people in this room, the people who drove out fake news 150 years ago when a similar blast of bad fake news came after the invention of the steam press were firstly readers deciding that they would only read things that were valid and good, and the other big thing was advertisers deciding they did not want to advertise beside this. And at the moment, I think it is a scandal in some ways that the same CEOs who would think many times before buying products from a factory they knew nothing about, or going to borrow money from a bank that they knew nothing about, would think of putting their brand in front of people in places they know nothing about. And I think that is likely to change. On the issue of this final question, my basic belief, and I suppose it goes all the way back to The Economist, is in the end, it is about creating product that people fundamentally want to pay for. And that can come in many forms, but that is the real end of what we do. Thank you very much. And that sets up the next panel, and Zani.